What's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and we're back again to do our my June, not our, but I would love to know what your best June reads were in the comments. But I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in June. I read 9 books, and I feel as if the month of June was so long. I definitely had some fun things happen, but also experienced June gloom, which is a new term that I heard, which is like my new thing that I'm going to start using instead of saying summertime sadness. However, now that we have moved into July, I do have to go back to saying summertime sadness. Anyways, I read 9 books. The month felt so long that in some regards, I'm kind of just like, so much has happened. Can I remember everything about these books? But whatever, we're diving right into it. The first book that I read was a nonfiction book that I did on Libby, Strong Passions, A Scandalous Divorce in Old New York by Barbara Weisberg. Now this I mostly spoke about in my May wrap-up because I finished this on June 1st, and so I just threw it in there. This is a scandalous story of a divorce that gripped the nation in the wake of the Civil War, where we see 2 high society people be really messy, and I was here for all the drama. I loved it. The next book that I read was also another nonfiction book. This was Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe, our king, our savior, and literally no one does nonfiction like him. Say Nothing is a deep dive into the Troubles. We start with the 1972 abduction of Jean McConville, who was a woman of, just a very just a woman of the community. She had recently gone through no, I was gonna say divorce. She wasn't divorced. Her husband had recently passed. She has like 7 or 8, maybe 9 or 10 kids. She doesn't know what to do. Like, she is quite poor and she has to take care of these kids. She's clearly like going through something, and then she is taken, and the children never see from her ever again. They live with this for the rest of their life, this just abandonment, and obviously this shapes their life and ruptures their family unit in ways that are unimaginable. And the author, my pal Patrick, then takes us through a journey of looking at some of the key players in the IRA's movement. We have Dolores Price, Brendan Hughes, Gerry Adams, and also Dolores Price's sister. And then we're seeing the ways in which the IRA were fighting for independence, and then how Gerry Adams, who is more of like a tactician, like he's very politically minded, how he shifts what the IRA is doing, because at first they're a paramilitary force, and so these people are volunteers of the community, many of them men, but there are some women like Dolores Price and her sister who sign up to fight the British and their impeachment on their liberties, and really just rally in the face of this colonizing force. And what Gerry kind of realizes as he is imprisoned at one point and things are moving along is that if they actually want to do something or get some sort of marginal change, that he would have to move into more like of a political bent. And so you're seeing the ways in which he manipulates the situation. We see different key moments in this 1980s movement. One of them is the various hunger strikes. There is the hunger strike that Dolores Price and her sister go through, which is really harrowing, and also the force feeding that they experience. We see how this experience of their time in prison, I think they spend a lot of their 20s in prison, how that really fucks with them and changes their perception of the violence that they brought about, and the ways that the media reacts to them, because they are 2 witty, beautiful women who are capable of murder, and what that means for the movement and also themselves. And we see Dolores Price as she ends up marrying, and whatever, there's so much going on, I can't get into all of it. But I do think one of the interesting things about this was you obviously have a fight for independence, and the people who are in it are really in it. And you see that once a sort of, not because independence is not reached, but there is a truce that is brokered, and you see how the people who were fighting for something and believed that they were fighting for something, that the lives that they were taking, it was done for our cause. You see how those people are then left forgotten on the wayside. They are suffering from PTSD. They die often alone. You see that angle. Yes, that is one thing. Then you also see the ways in which the people who are involved in the IRA struggle, who are really like in it, who are out on the streets, they have a sense of purpose. But for the rest of the community, primarily women and children who are not, you know, actively engaged in this, they are suffering from their own kind of PTSD because they feel depressed. Like, it's a lot going on. It's a lot to bear the weight of this danger 24/7. And it's a book that gives you a lot to think about and is incredibly depressing and harrowing. There were times that I had to take a break. I also do think that this pairs quite nicely with a book that I read last year, by Fintan O'Toole, The Stories We Tell Ourselves. We Don't Know Ourselves, which is looking at more so like the cultural media stuff, but I do think it ties quite nicely with a lot of the characters in here, a lot of the stories. That book heavily focuses on the 1981 hunger strike, which focused on about 5 to 7 men, and I think it's just those two books in tandem would be a really great match if you're interested in learning more about Ireland, this fights for independence. And also another thing that we learn in here is the ways in which the British are, what is the right word? Innovating on torture. And that is such a disgusting thing to say, because when you hear some of the ways in which the Irish were tortured, it is very like horrible. We learn about the key player who had spent time in Africa and was really like looking at counterintelligence and torture, and that's like another undercurrent in there that I thought was interesting. There was also one fact that I want to share. This was because a lot of what Say Nothing is about, and that line comes from a Seamus Heaney poem that I recently read and reread again because it was so good, is this idea that because the community is so small and everyone knows everyone, there is this social contract, an unspoken social contract in which certain things are expected from people, and that you do not fraternize with the enemy. You do not run your mouth, because if you run your mouth, you know what's going to happen. And so that's this like also another theme that's running throughout this. But at one point we learned that the fear of women fraternizing with the enemy, you know, being involved with British officers and having relations with them, especially while their significant others may be in British jails, like that was such a strong fear that romantically and ideologically that the women could fall prey to this. There was what is the word? There was a response to this, a punishment rather, that is more accurate. There was a punishment for women who may have spoken nicely or had a relation with a British officer, and that was that these women would have their heads shaved, would then be tarred and feathered and chained outside. Like, that is crazy. When I found out that detail, I was shocked. I mean, this is the 80s, and this is happening. Like, tarring and feathering, I thought that was like an American Revolution thing, but no, that's that book. I did speak a lot on that, so I would say check it out if it's of interest. The next book that I read was Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. This is a biography on Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, the wife of JFK Jr. And if you spent any time on Instagram, TikTok, and if you receive fashion or fashion adjacent content, you've probably seen videos discussing Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's style, the images, the infamous fight of her and her mans in the park yelling at each other. Like, there's so much that we still see about her, and so I thought this would be an interesting book to read, that it would add more context. But the thing is, our author starts off with the most honorable of intentions. She wants to create a nuanced portrait of this woman who's so private and who was belittled by the media, and she also wants to show the ways in which the media of the 90s really played a role in diminishing Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy and like who she was as a woman. But what happens is that our author is in love with Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy, and this becomes more of a love letter to her, in which every page we either encounter quotes from her friends, or, you know, the author herself saying, but she was so beautiful, and she was so kind, and she was a glowing light within the New York sky. And anyway, so and then after a while, it kind of gets to the point where you're like, We get it. Let's move on. Let's really get, let's get gritty. Let's get granular. But that doesn't happen. And I think also as I moved along in this, I have read What Remains, which is Carole Radziwill's memoir. I think that's what the book is called. And towards the end, I was kind of annoyed because a lot of the quotes from that are like put in here. So I was kind of just like, how much new research was happening here versus us just being shown a lot of old quotes? Like that kind of annoyed me. But however, I do think this does help us learn a little bit more about, obviously, Carolyn's childhood. She comes from a Catholic family, a Catholic Italian family, born in New York, but mostly raised in Connecticut. She was someone who was social her whole entire life. Like that was something she was quite well at. We kind of get the understanding that she was quite empathetic, and she had an ability to talk to people. And she was also really driven. Like she worked hard. She worked all through college. She was working at Calvin Klein at the boutique in Chestnut Hill in the Boston area. She went to BU, and from there she was then kind of selected to work in the corporate office in New York, which is honestly really interesting. And I don't think, when you think about like the fashion space, I don't think that happens as much now, where people are picked from the stores to then work in corporate, and that's an interesting thing to consider. Anyway, so once she's like in New York, she is like meeting people, she's working in fashion. She moves her way into like the PR space and production, and then she meets JFK, and we see their relationship. And it was kind of, they had a desire to be private, and it was on and off again because JFK was like, there were other women that he had also been dating prior to, whatever. And I do think some of the interesting things that we see, like, first of all, Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy's mother, I don't think she really liked JFK, or the fact that by being involved with him, her life was becoming so public. There is, at one point, we find out that Carolyn's mother emails her a news clipping of JFK, like the media speaking about him and another woman. And in the margins, her mother has written, "Carolyn, when will you move on with your life?" Like, that's kind of wild. And you see just like, JFK is someone, you know, America's darling. He could do no wrong. And it's just an interesting thing to consider that, like, yes, this man who is so venerated in the States, like, this might not be a mother's perfect match for her daughter. And I thought that was like an interesting detail to see. We also find out things about, you know, the pressure that JFK was under. And I think, like, if you're someone who's really obsessed with the Kennedys, you probably might already know a lot of these things. Some of this stuff was news to me, like how JFK, when he failed the law exam, the bar, he put himself up into a hotel room for the weekend and drank a bottle of whiskey, and while listening to some sad album that I forget right now. So that was something. Let's see what I pointed out here. Okay, and then also what we're seeing, and I think this is the biggest takeaway in this book, which is that Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy is known for her style sense, her fashion sense, for predominantly wearing a very muted color palette, for never wearing jewelry, for having a bare face, for having the straight hair that is a particular shade of blonde, and wearing red lips if she were to adorn herself in any capacity. And what we see is that the author is making the case that these sartorial choices were occurring because Carolyn did not want to give the media any reason to pick her apart. And so she decided to dress very, like, not conservatively, because she did clearly have an eye, but to dress in a way that wouldn't draw attention to herself. Unfortunately, by doing that, she actually did, like, people love it, and they loved it, and they still love it. And that's what we are kind of seeing. So basically, the author will, like, pepper in these, like, what she was known to wear in college and in her early career when she was working at Calvin Klein, when she would come into the office with hair that hadn't been washed and Converse and a flowing gypsy skirt, blah, blah, blah. And then we see this shift towards her wearing, like, Yoji and Prada and those kinds of things. And then the main case that is being made, if I haven't said that enough, is basically her style choices came from a desire for her to fade from media attention, but also she was kind of dressing in what the author thinks she thought that a Kennedy wife should dress and look like. And as we move towards the ultimate untimely demise of both Carolyn, her husband, and her sister, What we also learn is that Carolyn felt a lot of worry about JFK flying, and a lot of the people in the family felt that way and did not want him to be flying. And it's kind of just crazy to think like their worries, you know. The next book that I read was a fantasy book, The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri. Now this is pitched as a sort of sapphic fantasy situation. And so we're introduced to, I think her name is Bria. There's two like main protagonists, but there's also a third lady who's very interesting. So we have Bria, who is a former temple child who is playing the role of a servant. And then we have Malini, is that her name? Yeah, then we have Malini, who is the princess who has been forced into an exile, and Bria is going to be attending to her. And then we have Bhumika, who is an aristocratic woman. And also a part of this like sapphic fantasy situation is that it's pitched as morally gray female characters. And I would have to say, I think Malini is morally gray, and I think Bhumika is morally gray, but Bria is not morally gray. And she does a lot of running around the story being like, I'm not strong and I don't know how to politic, blah, blah, blah. And things like that kind of grate me, because it's just like, you're in this situation, deal with it. And what's happening is that this is a very rich, fantastical world that draws a lot from Indian, like the subcontinent's mythos. And we see that one kingdom has colonized another, and as a result of that, there's a lot of discourse in the novel about colonization, which to me felt a little bit too much on the nose. Like I'm not moving into critiques, and that was that. But what is happening here is that there's this weird magical rot that is affecting many of the people in this nation and the neighboring nations, where individuals will have like vines growing on them and like leaves, and it's really weird. And the only thing that can combat that is holy wood. So, and that's also dwindling, I think. And so there's a lot happening, and there's a current emperor, Princess Malini's brother, who is evil and believes that women should be burned, because by doing so, by them performing like sati, that they are cleansing the nation and also themselves, and it is the highest honor that a woman can do. And you know, her brother wanted Malini to do this and she didn't, and that's why she was exiled. So that's kind of like the backstory. And the thing is, what I didn't like about this book, one, as I mentioned earlier, was the on-the-nose colonization chats. The second thing was we get so many points of view shifts that breaks the narrative just a little bit, because some of those characters, the smaller, lesser male characters, who we get their perspectives of, I kind of just like, they're not compelling enough for us to be in their head. And while I was reading it, there were times where I was like, okay, like, how could we have found out this information without having been in so-and-so's head? And then the third thing that I disliked was that, okay, I am okay if a character is a Mary Sue. Bria basically has all of the components of what would be a Mary Sue. However, she has flaws, and her flaws are, one, her big nose, and second, she is dark skinned. And I didn't like that. And you would say that I think some of the people, because after that I went to go read the Goodreads reviews, some of them were just like, oh, this novel is shedding light on colorism. And I personally think that if you are like writing a fantasy novel in which you can make the rules whatever you want, if you wanted to alter our understanding of colorism, why couldn't you have made it such that, like, so it wasn't basically the equivalent of our current world, in which, you know, in the South Asian context and many other contexts, that, you know, fair, light-skinned people are considered beautiful. Like, why couldn't it have been that it was switched, or instead that they could have all just been beautiful? Like, why couldn't that happen? Like, I personally am okay with, like, because when I'm reading a book, I just kind of assume everyone's hot. Like, you can make up the picture in your head. I don't really need your description. So why can't they all be hot? However, on the flip side, then you have something like Sarah J. Maas, in which every character is so hot and the hottest girl who's ever lived and more beautiful. And then it's like, that's too much hot. Just tell us that people are hot and let's move on. That's sad. I think will continue with the series. It's a trilogy. I didn't realize that. But the second book is out. The third should be coming out, I think, end of this year or next year. Then I read a book courtesy of NetGalley. Shout out NetGalley. This is If Only by Vigdis Hjorth. And I really like this book. So basically this book, if you don't know, Vigdis wrote Is Mother Dead, which was longlisted for International Booker 2 years ago, 2022. And that's like really lovely. And this book, If Only, is, I think it came out in the early 2000s and is considered like her greater book. However, I actually think that Is Mother Dead is the stronger novel. It is more pared down, more to the point, and less like busyness. If Only does get to be a little repetitive, but I haven't told you what it's about just yet. Starts off with us being introduced to our narrator, who is, I think, an unnamed woman throughout the whole thing. And she's 31 years old. She is married. She has a husband. She's married and she has a daughter. And she has like an okay life. However, she writes in her journal like something along the lines of, let me get the exact quote. I think I might have said that she was 31 in the novel, but actually she's 30. And this is like the quote that I think comes in the blurb, which is when we find her, when we are introduced to her at the early onset of the novel, she has written in her diary that she is waiting for the heartbreak that will turn her into her true self. She has an impending sense of doom or possibly her own death. So she is waiting for the emotional heartbreak that will make her into her true self, which is such a interesting thing to say, especially as you are already married. So she then is, very unhappy with her life, and on one of her traveling trips or whatever it is that she does, because she happens to be a playwright, but mostly she's writing radio plays, and she meets this man, a professor who is a translator of German, I believe, and he is 10 years older than her. He is bald, and in some regards she's kind of just like, why am I attracted to this guy? Because there are certain qualities about him that like I don't physically like. For example, one of them is that his toenail is overgrown, and she's like, how in the world could I possibly be with a man like this? However, that is not enough to keep her away from him, because she then embarks on a 10-year-long relationship with this man. In the first 3 years of this encounter, because basically the first time that they meet, they do fuck, and she becomes fixated on him, and he is married. He's on his second marriage, and or maybe his third. And he's like a really messy guy. And so you're seeing the ways in which she devotes herself to him, the idea of him, this possible relationship, this yearning for him. She has a strong desire to sublimate the self through love. And she kind of like blows her life up in order to make that happen. She divorces her husband. Her family is aghast that she does this. She gets her own house. And like in the very, very beginnings, you see the ways in which she like kind of starts to live her best life. She is like making progress, making moves, but also doing everything with the hope that she would be reunited with him. And it does happen. They do end up entering into a relationship, but there's a line in the book which is, their tragedy wasn't that they couldn't be together. The tragedy was that they were together. And that is what this book is about. It is about the ways in which they are together. And she does like feel as if when she is with him, he sees something in her that no one else has ever been able to see beforehand. But you also see the ways in which this relationship is very toxic. It's very destructive, violent. And then as things move along and progress, and they kind of, people in relationships, they create their own vernacular in which to speak with each other, and like their own kind of language and phrases, and certain things mean this and are references to that, and you're seeing the ways in which they do that, and the ways in which they tell themselves stories about how their love is different than everyone else's, and that they are two people who are really willing to embrace the entire breadth of the human experience, and part of that results in them doing some things that are really hedonistic that they don't like, but they don't articulate to each other that they don't like it, because to do that would then mean that they're like other people, which is ultimately boring. And so you're seeing that, and you're seeing the ways in which the people around them don't necessarily, like their relationship. They are two people who are often arguing, and if you were friends with them, it would be infuriating. And you see that, and it's like kind of depressing and intense read, but I was like in it. I loved it. I think I want it. Like I would like to reread this. I also think that this, because it's just the subject matter, which is ultimately an intense, destructive, toxic relationship, would be read with Kairos. Like reading those two in tandem makes for interesting discussion and dialogue. And yeah, I really liked the book. I kind of was considering doing an individual book review about it because I felt like I had so much I wanted to say, but those are the main the final thing that I actually want to say is that what's interesting about this is that the narrator and also her man There's one thing, oh my god, should I tell you guys? Okay, so basically at one point, once the object of her desire, the man, has decided that he is going to divorce his wife, he isn't even sure that he will be with her. He's like, yeah, I'm also like fucking 6 other women at the same time. And you're like, what? How? Like, I mean, not how, but like, why? Anyway, so that's one thing. The second thing that I find quite interesting, this is probably more so a revelation of the author's particular interest, is that our narrator is, there's like lots of lines about how she doesn't get she doesn't get along very well with her family, and there are moments where she's like, she's not talking to them, or like that's actually, you know, whatever, and the ways in which the man is also like doing something similar. But I just thought that was an interesting idea to consider, because in some regards I'm like, do we even really need all these like mentions and allusions to how she's not speaking to her family and how she has like a complicated relationship with them? But then I do think when you look about the author's like personal life, maybe that's where that comes from. But that was like an interesting thing to consider, like this kind of through line running through her work, this familial estrangement. The next book that I read was All Fours by Miranda July. This was my first novel by Miranda July, and while I was reading this, there were like a few references or things that were like really top of mind for me, and I like should have written them down. I did write them down, but I don't know where I put the list, so there goes that when it comes to planning. But one of them in particular was New Girl, and I say that because I personally think that our protagonist, who is a woman in her 40s, she's actually 45, she is married, she has a child, and she is also a semi-famous artist who has dabbled in many mediums. This character to me is very twee, even though she's quite sexual and there are some like really wild things that are happening in that realm. She's also just really quirky and very like, I'm so different, you know, like that's like really running through this. But that's why I kept on thinking about that. And she also, like, as a result of that, has a tendency to do things that are, she's so fixated on the self through this novel. And in this novel, what we're really seeing is that she is having her midlife crisis. She is coming to grips with the transition into menopause, but what occurs before menopause is perimenopause. And she's really like seeing the ways in which this biological shift is rupturing her understanding of self and desire and agency. And when we start, we're introduced to her. We get this understanding from her husband that there are people in this world who are parkers and there are people who are drivers. And what this car analogy shows us is that Miranda, the protagonist, is a parker. She is someone who is, unlike a driver, unable to like kind of be happy-go-lucky and take things as they go and just enjoy the beauty in the everyday. She is, as a parker, someone who enjoys kind of doing a feat that is unimaginable, to park the car in such a tight, tiny little spot and be like, look at me, look at what I've done, look at how I've done this. That is who she is. And so this comment her husband has made really irks her. Now, personally, I'm kind of just like, can't a person be both? I think I'm both. And so she is annoyed by this, and she tells her husband that she is going to go on a road trip across the country. She's going to go from LA to New York and live life. And what she ends up doing is just going to the town next door, which is a fake town. I thought it was a real town and I Googled it, but it's not. And she's there. She finds herself a little motel room and she spends $20,000 to renovate the motel room, just one room. And the person who renovates the room is, I think her name is Claire, but she is the wife of Miranda, the protagonist's love object. And so this guy, Davy, is 31 years old. He's a dancer, and you're seeing the ways in which the protagonist and Davy are embarking onto this like emotional affair in which they are toggling with a kind of like will they, won't they, but also like what are the ways in which you can experience love with someone. Like she does love her husband, but then she also like meets Davy, and the love that she's feeling for him is one very like body based, but also like they are understanding each other on a soul level in a way that her husband would not. I think her husband's name is Harris, in a way that he is not able to. And so we're just seeing that like development. And what's interesting to think is that as the novel progresses, part one is really fixated on this like relationship. You see the ways in which our narrator, and this is kind of similar to If Only, that these women are, you know, affairs of the heart. They can take a greater importance and can really derail your life. And you're seeing the ways in which that is happening. Like both of these women are mothers, they are caretakers, but they're moving on autopilot. Like while they are as the narrator in All Fours, as she's making the 5-course lunch for her kid, she is also like, she's operating on autopilot, and what she's really doing is thinking about Davy and like when she can go to her computer and check his Instagram profile and all of these things. And you're seeing the ways in which just, you think that like with age one gains wisdom and would be able to like separate the two and separate like love and the day-to-day practicalities and would be able to get on with your life, but really you're not. We're all just hoping for life-changing love, and we'll fixate on these things and, you know, ruin our life possibly in order to make it so that we can have something greater, which might not actually be that great. And, you know, thematically, obviously this perimenopause is a big deal. Desire and also art and the ways in which dance can be, this experience of the body can be something transcendent. And I think this was, you know, an interesting read. I think it's well worth reading. However, you do have to, what is it called? You would have to like, you have to give it a long leash. You have to be willing to drop the rules of reality, because spending $20K to renovate a motel room for 2 weeks, like that's, who does that? Like, you know, those like, you have to be the kind of person who's gonna read that and just take it as it is. You can't like fixate it on it too much. And I did think it's interesting also to consider like, another thing, like this is a smaller thing to consider, is that our narrator is a woman for whom she doesn't really think of herself as wealthy, but yet she is wealthy, right? Because she made $20K just, and this is what also kind of annoyed me, because the number 20K is dropped so much, but because she's saying 20K, that she made 20K, but the reality is she didn't actually make 20K. She had to make more than 20K, because 30% of that would have had to have gone for taxes, and at least 10% of that also would have gone to her agent to pay that woman something. So 40%. So she had to be making more than that in order to then have the 20K just lying around. Like, that's what I'm thinking about, you know? And so where was I going with this? The narrator is someone who can casually drop 20K and doesn't at one point consider like, how else could I use this 20K, that I could put this aside for my child's high school education or college education, or put it into a trust for them or something like that. She doesn't think anything like practical in any capacity in that regards. And so what we're also just kind of seeing is this like extreme privilege. And I don't think like that's really the point that one needs to take from here, that this needed to be something that was cognizant of the ways in which, you know, different people in different socioeconomic classes are moving. But I just think it's interesting to see the ways in which its absence makes it noticeable. Do you get what I'm saying? Because she is quite privileged, but she doesn't think she's privileged. And just that like tension is something that at times I was reminded of, even though that's not like what the main theme of this book is. So we're gonna put a pin on that, because I really went on about that. The next book that I read was Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. This is my second John Williams novel. The first one that I read was Nothing But the Dark, which just so happens to be his debut novel, the one in which he dislikes and actually doesn't want people to read and distances himself completely. However, I do think it was helpful to read that, because there were lots of things from there that thematically I thought were in line with this. I need to take a sip of water. I've been talking so much. Okay, where was I? I was talking about John Williams. So, Nothing But the Light, what is that? Nothing But the Night is the story of a young man who is, it's kind of a coming of age novel, not really, it's very, very slim, and he is grappling with this childhood trauma and is trying to like figure a way for himself in life, but is unable to do so because of this childhood trauma. But he like sets off kind of on his own, and there's this one scene in which he's with a woman in a room, but then runs out, and there's something very similar that happens in this, and I think what's also interesting to think about. So what this book is about, this is about our main character, William. However, actually, we're not even gonna get there just yet. So William is a young man from Boston who has been studying in Harvard for 3 years, but drops out in order to go west because he wants to see the world, because he is tired of academia, because he feels like there's more to life than rote memorization and sitting in the stifled classroom atmosphere. And so he goes out west. His father connects him up with this man who is involved in, his father connects him with a man who is involved in the bison industry, who's like works in the selling of hides. And this guy is just like, yeah, you know, like, come work with me. I have so much paperwork. You can totally do it. But Williams is like, no, I don't know if I want to be in an office. Who really wants to? No one, right? And so what he actually ends up doing is going on an expedition with this guy named, what is his name? Oh, with a guy named Miller, who is someone who seems quite sensible, but as we find out more, is probably not. But basically, Miller is a man who is, you know, very much of this time and space that he's in. He's really a man of action. He's really connected to nature, and he has this like lifelong wish to return to this hidden spot in nature in which there are thousands upon thousands of bison, and he wants to kill them all and make a killing and rack in all the money. And so he has a sidekick named Charlie Hodge, who is a man that is addled. He has a strong relationship with God that is fearful and intense, and he also only has one arm, like a stub of an arm, because he lost his arm in frostbite. And then we're introduced to another character who is kind of like a grumpy, bit of an antagonist. He's not very happy to be doing anything, and it's Schneider. And he comes through to fill out this quartet. So you have these four men who embark onto this adventure. They go out west, more west than they already are, in order to hunt bison. And what you're seeing, wow, I've been saying bison the whole time. It's not bison, it's buffalo. Okay, it's been a crazy hour that I've been chatting away. Anyways, buffalo. Just think that I thought buffalo this whole entire time. So they go off into the wilderness, and you're seeing how Will is interacting with nature. And what Will has a tendency to do, this happens when he is first like in that little ramshackle town, is that he kind of like fades away into oblivion. The ways in which he is looking at the sublime beauty, but then also his sense of self is like retreating. And that's an interesting thing that like pops up a few times. And when he is out in nature, he's seeing this beauty. Like what he really wanted to do is to see raw, sublime beauty of the natural world and the ways in which it is untethered to humanity. And as we're moving along through this novel, you would expect that something like this would bring these four men together, that they would form a bond. But in actuality, they become more isolated the longer they spend out in the wild. And you see how they commit an act that is so heinous. The destruction, the absolute destruction of the buffalo is horrible. I saw it later because I looked on Goodreads to look at a review. Someone had posted a photo, and I'll probably insert it here. Now I have to do it because I mentioned that, of this man like standing before a huge heap of buffalo bones. And it's just so upsetting to consider this. And you also actually see, like, as this is happening, the ways in which Schneider becomes a voice of reason to try to be like, you know, let's pull back. Let's actually, we've done enough. We've caused enough destruction. But Miller is hell-bent on doing this. Like, he loses touch with his humanity as he's doing this. And Will has, like, he's just there for the ride. And it's actually in that regards where you're kind of like, Will almost isn't the main character. It's probably the nature that is the main character. And then you're seeing the ways in which he is thinking about, you know, his relationship with women. Like, that is a light layer that is in this book because of Francine, who is a woman that we're introduced to at the beginning of the novel, and then she comes up at the end again. And they do this they do this massive quest. A quest seems honorable. It's not really honorable what they do. And then they return and things are not what they expected. And you see that destruction. And then when the novel ends, it ends in such an interesting way because it's like, has Will changed? Like, I don't know. He has experienced some change, but he hasn't exactly. And it's almost as if you want to see what Will would have done next, because he gets to a point where he's made a decision. He's not going to return to Boston. You get the impression that he probably never will, but then you're like, where is he going to go? What is he going to do? And that's what we don't know. But I just thought it was interesting to wrap this up, to consider this with Nothing But the Night, in which we're also looking at a young man who's trying to find his place in the world and does some things that are also similar, but ultimately falls into a bit of madness. And so that's kind of the difference between the two. And so then after that, I think I needed something lighter. So I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. This is my first Emily Henry book that I read. And in some regards, I kind of expected more from it. And I don't know, maybe that's on me for having those expectations, but the ways in which people speak about her and her writing, like, her writing is very smooth and it's easy to fall in line with it. And this is the story of Funny Story, is the story of a young woman. She's 31 years old, who is a librarian who has moved to the Michigan area, I believe, and she moved there because her fiance had bought a house there. And then it's like a couple months before the wedding, and then she finds out, or maybe like weeks, she finds out that her fiance has broken off the engagement because he actually is in love with his childhood best friend. And so what our narrator ends up doing, what her name is Daphne. She ends up moving in with the ex-boyfriend of that childhood bestie. So they like swap couples basically. And so this then becomes a fake dating love story. Like that's that trope that is being played out. And you know what? This is a fun book. Like I read it on the plane coming back from Paris, and I like read it in 5 hours. Like it is so just smooth and easy to read, which is kind of an interesting thing. I did this on Libby. Thank you, Libby, for this, because when you look at the book in the bookstore, it seems kind of thick, but then like it's really just easy to get through it. Anyways, I like kind of wish like we had played with the fake dating just a little bit more. She kind of like subverts that almost in the way that they start fake dating, but they don't actually have to do many things that involve them fake dating. And then other characters are introduced, like Miles, who's her roommate slash now pretend boyfriend. His sister comes through. The narrator Daphne, she's like develops a friendship with the other librarians. Like that's also happening at the same time. But what this book is also like, what I think is like sometimes when reading these kinds of things, like Daphne's, the protagonist's like main issue is that she has abandonment issues because of her father, and like that is something that comes up all the time. And her father's like also shows up, and he's changed but also hasn't changed. And Miles's like relationship state can be explained by his childhood trauma. And so like that was kind of like kind of like, do we need this much childhood trauma up in here? But yeah, I just felt like there would be times where it would be like, now again, we have to hear about Daphne's father, and then also Daphne's weird relationship with her mother. And that's kind of my quibble, if you would. I actually have two quibbles. One of them is that Daphne's supposed to be so close to her mother, like think Gilmore Girls, Rory, Lorelai, which ultimately at the end of the day is a very codependent relationship. But Daphne's like loves her mother so much, and they schedule to chat once a week on the phone for like 2 hours. But I just get the impression that Daphne is the kind of woman who is speaking to her mother all day long because she has no friends. She has no life. And that's really what this book is about, how she has no life, how she devoted herself to her ex. And then Miles comes through and he's like kind of teaching her how to live life. But is she really? Because actually she's actually kind of just doing the same thing that she was doing with Peter. Is that what his name was? Anyways, that was that. And then the second thing was like one of Daphne's personality quirks is that every time she has good food, she moans, and it becomes like a bit between her and Miles. And I just think it was a bit too much. Like it was not that funny. So that's that. It was fun. I don't know if I feel compelled to read more of her work, but no complaints. Even though, you know. And then after that, I read something random. This was also shout out Libby for these nonfiction books that I'm stumbling across. This book was all about Willa Cather, and let me get the full title for you. Chasing Bright Medusas, A Life of Willa Cather. This book is not exactly a biography because we are more so heavily looking at the ways in which her life intersected with her work. And so as someone who's not that cognizant of a lot of her work, even though she was, you know, a titan of literary, like American letters, if you would, that's like on me. Like I should definitely now go and read some of her work, but it was still like a kind of a decent entryway, but I don't think it's necessarily, if you don't know anything about this author, probably don't pick this book up, which is the mistake I made. So we're learning more about Willa Cather. Willa Cather was a predecessor to Hemingway and Faulkner, and she is, the way the author presents her is as a woman who was writing about the World War, and unlike Hemingway, she is actually more like hopeful, and so that's like kind of a contrast. And you see the ways in which she primarily built her career off of journalism, and then at the age of 40, that's when she started publishing novels. And then towards the end of her life, that's really when she found her stride in her writing and was producing these like wonderful, incredible works. And she really excelled when she would be doing this kind of playing with historical fiction and the ways in which, you know, different experiences from her childhood came to play. Because when she was born, I think she was like, though like born, like brought up in a very American capacity, she was also, you know, introduced to a lot of immigrants. So she wasn't someone who was like born in New York City or anything like that. There was just so many immigrants around her, and those women really like informed some of the themes and like characters that would show up later in her work. And yeah, it was an interesting read. That was that. It's definitely made me curious to look up more of her writing. If you have any recommendations for a novel that you think I should start with when it comes to Willa Cather's work, let me know. I've spoken so much, so I'm just going to wrap this up right here. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.